What is a residential service? A residential service provides accommodation where the occupants pay rent to use one or more rooms, but they do not have the right to occupy the whole premise, and where occupants share facilities such as bathroom, kitchen, dining room, and common areas outside of the resident's room, and in a place which has rooms available for at least 4 occupants, and in a place where occupants do not occupy self-contained units. However, there is a caveat to that, which I'll explain later in the presentation. There are 3 different levels of residential service. A level 1 residential service is where a service is conducted in which each of the residents occupy a room and shares a bathroom, kitchen, dining room, and common room with other residents. There is a level 1 and level 2 service, which is often simply referred to as a level 2 service, and that is where the service is conducted in which each of the residents occupy a room and shares a bathroom, kitchen, dining room, and or common room with other residents and is provided with a food service. And there is also a level 1, 2, and 3 service, which is often referred to simply as a level 3 service. And that is where a service is conducted in which each of the residents occupies a room and shares a bathroom, kitchen, dining room, and common room with other residents as provided in some instances with a food service, but in all instances with a personal care service. In all levels, the occupants do not have the right to occupy the whole of a premise. There are currently 252 services registered as a residential service with the Department of Housing, and those services are registered for a maximum occupancy of 7,497 residents. We can split that information down even further into level 1, level 2, and level 3 services, which you'll see on the screen. But importantly, some information about what residents look like that live in a residential service. In most instances, they are low income earners. Based on research, it's a couple of years old now, just under 2/3 of residents are on a disability pension. Just under 1/3 of residents are on an age pension, and the remaining less than 5% are on some other type of income. Mostly residential services are occupied by individuals. Based on the income types people are receiving, a significant proportion have a disability or are an older person, and there is a outlier with the number of older women that live in residential services. And people often live in a residential service because they are experiencing barriers to access alternate appropriate accommodation, specifically where they're attempting to occupy accommodation with further assistance from a service provider. So what does this mean for specialist disability accommodation providers and supported independent living providers? Before the full implementation of the NDIS, providers who receive government funding under the Disability Services Act 2006 were exempt from registering as a residential service. Since the full implementation of the NDIS, providers that were previously receiving funding under the Disability Services Act 2006 are no longer exempt from registering as a residential service. It's important to note that providers need to make an assessment of the criteria of Section 4 in the Residential Services Accreditation Act 2002 to determine if they are providing accommodation services to residents that meet the definition of a residential service. The Department of Housing will work with you and your organisations to assist you to understand what accommodation services you provide to residents may meet the definition of a residential service, and we will assist you in determining what criteria you need to meet for registration. Not all disability accommodation provider portfolios will be captured under the residential services legislation. There are a number of exemptions in the legislation, and Sandra will be going through that in more detail later in the presentation. Exemptions can be found in the Residential Services Accreditation Act under Section 4.5. Residential service registration and what is involved. There are 4 key components to registration as a residential service. Firstly, the person operating the service must be a suitable person. The building which is being used as accommodation must meet specific building requirements. The property being used as accommodation must also meet specified fire safety requirements, and there are some registration fees and the requirement to obtain criminal history checks. We'll go through each of those 4 quadrants now. To be a suitable person, both the service provider and any associates involved in the operation of the service must be a suitable person. And in deciding if a person is a suitable person, the Chief Executive of the Department of Housing may have regard to the person's criminal history. Minimum building requirements. To operate a residential service, the property which is being used for accommodation must meet the mandatory Part 5.7 Residential Services Building Standard of the Building Act 1975. MP 5.7 covers performance requirements for things like bedrooms, bathrooms, toilets, laundries, kitchens, and other areas. It also covers sanitation, ventilation, and vermin control requirements. It has some fire safety requirements in regards to early warning systems and emergency lighting, as well as the requirement to have an emergency telephone. Building compliance inspection certification of MP 5.7 is undertaken by your relevant local council, and your local council are likely to charge you fees for the completion of a building compliance inspection and certification in accordance with MP 5.7. The property must also meet minimum fire safety standards, and there are 2 different components to this. The first component relates to smaller services that have 4 or 5 residents occupying the property. In that instance, the property must have a fire safety management plan. That plan is a document which is available on the QFES website, and the regulatory services team can assist you in completing that plan. For larger services that have 6 or more residents, those properties are required to meet mandatory Part 2.1 fire safety in budget accommodation buildings. MP 2.1 covers things such as portable fire extinguishers, hose reels and firefighting water supply, smoke alarm management, and sprinkler systems. Certification for compliance with MP 2.1 is undertaken by Queensland Fire and Emergency Services. Registration fee. As at 1st of July 2023, the current registration fee sits at $360.30 per registration, and you may incur additional fees in obtaining a criminal history check through either the QPS or your preferred criminal history check provider. There are some risks of not having a registration as a residential service. Operating an unregistered residential service is a criminal offence under the Residential Services Accreditation Act. There is the risk that residents could be living in a property that doesn't meet the required building and or fire safety compliance requirements. There is the possibility of abuse or exploitation of residents, and relocation of residents may have significant negative impacts on resident health and well-being. The Department of Housing will work with you to determine if your organisation needs to be registered. Completing an assessment form, which was recently emailed to all specialist disability accommodation providers and supported independent living providers, will give us information about the accommodation services you provide to residents. Regulatory services will review your response and let you know if one or more of your properties may fit the criteria of the requirements to be registered as a residential service, and where it is not immediately clear if a property fits the criteria of the requirement to register, we may request additional information and or conduct a site visit with you at the property to assist in making that determination. I now ask Sandra to join us. Sandra will be taking us through the next several slides regarding the assessment form that was recently emailed to all specialist disability accommodation providers and supported independent living providers. Sandra, are you with us?
Yes, thanks, Terry. All right, I'll just begin with the assessment form. Thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. I'm just going to go through the assessment form and how it needs to be completed. So all providers would have received their assessment form last Friday, the 8th of September, provided with a link for you to fill out the assessment form. So on the first page of the assessment form, we've given you some instructions and what you need to do. So on the first page, all you need to do is type in your organisation name, your contact name, email address and a phone number. Then you could refer to the bottom of the tab. So the next tab that you refer to will be the assessment tab. So with the assessment tab, what you would need to do is with the columns will complete you with the addresses of all the properties you manage, and this will determine whether those properties will fit the criteria for a registration. So if you just list all the properties down the first column, question 1 will refer to, do residents pay individual rent for each room? Then you click on the yes or no button under question 1. For question 2, any rooms in properties that are available for occupancy to at least 4 residents, whether or not it's in the same property, you click yes or no for question 2. And for question 3, it's asking you, do residents share any facilities outside of the resident's room? And this could be a dining room, a kitchen or a bathroom. And you click yes or no. And with question 4, this one is a drop down as well. So it's choose the property type for each property, and you'll have the options of owner, provider, social housing, resident owned, department owned or other. So if you could just click on which one applies to each property. Question 5 is free text. So it's asking you the number of residents living in each property. So if you can just put down the number for each property and how many residents occupy that property. And for question 6, so this one is about an exemption. So you may not be operating a residential service if you fall within the criteria of any of the exemptions listed in this tab. So if you go to the exemptions tab, it'll explain to you what each exemption is. So you may fall within the aged care, mental health service, private hospital, school accommodation, education department, Social Security Act, holiday makers, licensed premises, state supported homelessness, Aboriginal hostel, disability services, funded under the department, under the Housing Act, employee accommodation and retirement village. If none of those exemptions apply to you, then you just click on the nil exemption. Once you've completed that form, if you could just send that form to the Regulatory Services email address, which is provided to you on that email that we sent to you last Friday, and the department will make an assessment of each property just to check whether the property may fit the criteria for the requirements of a registration as a residential service. Once we've completed that form, there are steps that you can take. So we do have a date of 21 October 2023 for this assessment form to be completed, where we will make those assessments, and it may also incur some phone calls in between. It doesn't mean that we've made a deadline of you are required to be registered at this stage. We're just making an assessment. Following from that, if you are required to be registered, there are processes where we will be sending out registration documents. And for that to be returned, you would require a completed building compliance notice via safety management plan with your registration application. And also 3 months after registration, there's an accreditation process. And I will leave it there and I'll hand you back to Terry. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sandy. We'll now move on to a number of scenarios that we've put together, which I hope will assist to answer some of your questions. As a quick recap, there are 3 different levels of residential service. Level 1 is accommodation only. Level 2 is accommodation and food service. Level 3 is accommodation, personal care assistance, and in some instances a food service. And the caveat that I mentioned earlier are aged rentals. And that cohort is today. But an aged rental is accommodation where a block of units are often used as accommodation, and it might have a communal kitchen. A communal kitchen provides meals to those older people living in those units, and those units are self-contained. But in the majority of scenarios, self-contained accommodation is not a residential service, and we'll go into that further in relation to disability accommodation shortly. So scenario 1 relates to rooming accommodation. So 4 or more residents that have separate rooming accommodation agreements and are sharing any facilities within a building, including bathroom, kitchen and dining, is likely to be operating as a residential service. The 4 or more is important, as well as the rooming accommodation agreement is important in making that determination on whether it is or is not a residential service. Scenario 2 relates to where the owner of a property is providing accommodation services to 4 or more residents and managing the operation of the service. This is where the owner-occupier of the property is subleasing rooms within the property. Important considerations of whether 4 or more residents are residing or subleasing in the property, and whether those residents have individual rooming accommodation agreements. If that is the case, then this property is, in most instances, operating as a residential service. Scenario 3A, there are 3A and 3B. Scenario 3A, if residents have their own individual self-contained unit and do not share any facilities with other residents, it is unlikely that accommodation is a residential service. Scenario 3B, again, self-contained units. A property has rooms for rent where 4 or more residents share facilities, including kitchen and bathroom, but the property also includes self-contained units, which includes their own bathroom and kitchen, and those people in those self-contained units don't share any facilities with other residents. If there are 4 or more people that are sharing and 4 or more people on individual rooming agreements, separate to those that are living in the self-contained accommodation, then it is likely that that property is a residential service. Scenario 4, leasing a property from an owner. So if you are head leasing a property from an owner and providing accommodation and managing the operation of the service, then you may be operating as the service provider of a residential service. So this is the scenario where an organisation is head leasing a property from the private rental market and then is subleasing the property to a number of residents who live at that property. If there are subleasing to 4 or more residents, and those 4 or more residents are on individual rooming accommodation agreements, then it is likely that that property is a residential service. Scenario 5 is a resident-owned property. And this is where a resident is an owner-occupier of a property and is renting to or subleasing rooms in the property to less than 4 residents. In this instance, this arrangement would not be a residential service, as the service does not capture 4 or more residents. Scenario 6. Scenario 6 relates to where a service is provided across multiple premises. Under the residential services legislation, there is the possibility that a residential service can be provided in 1 or more buildings or 1 or more premises. In this situation, an assessment would need to be undertaken that considers whether there are services or facilities being shared across those multiple premises to determine whether it is captured or not. And in this scenario, the department would need to be considering the circumstances relating to the occupancy and use of those properties, and would need to provide some advice to the provider, the disability accommodation provider, in regards to whether the property is likely to be captured or not.
Scenario 7. Scenario 7 relates to where a property owner head leases the property to the real estate agent who manages the accommodation on their behalf. In this instance, the property owner may be operating a residential service and the real estate agent acting as their associate, assisting them with operating the residential service. This again only relates where the property has 4 or more people on individual tenant rooming accommodation agreements and they're sharing services such as kitchens, bathrooms and laundries.
So that brings us to the end of our scenarios, and I'll invite Sandra to join us again. Sandra, are there any questions in the chat for us?
So the question is, would an affordable housing provider be under other? So this refers to the assessment forms that needs to be filled out. So the answer is yes. You would click other in regards to that question. So there is a question, is a garden considered a common area?
A garden is not normally a common area. A common area would normally be potentially lounge rooms or recreational facilities within a property. A garden would not be captured as a communal facility.
Thank you, Terry. We have another question. We have people we support who own their own home and share with other people with a disability. Are you suggesting they are coming under these regulations?
It depends on the sharing arrangements and how many people they are sharing with. If there's 4 or more people that make up the service that are sharing with the resident, then potentially they are captured. If it is a smaller arrangement, then less than 4 people, then they would not be captured.
Thank you, Terry. We have another question. If the property is an SDA and owned and managed by an SDA provider, and we are only providing SIL supports, not having anything to do with the rental aspect, would the SDA provider need to be registered?
We're likely to need to talk to the SDA provider and also the agent which is responsible for renting out that property to determine whether it is captured or not. So in that scenario, if the SDA provider is not collecting the rent, is not selecting the residents, then they are unlikely to be the party that needs to be registered under our legislation. But we'd need to have a clearer understanding on who's making what decisions around the terms and conditions by which the residents are occupying the premise, who are they entering into tenancy agreements with, who are they paying rent to, how many residents are there. So in some instances, it could be the SDA provider. In some instances, it could be a different party that would need to be registered if there are 4 or more residents there and they're on individual tenancy agreements, and it meets the other parts of the definition of a residential service.
Thank you, Terry. We have another question. If you wanted to confirm whether you qualify for residential with the department, how do you go about it?
Yeah, certainly. So the next slide, we have our contact details on. So we do have a dedicated mailbox and phone number by which you can contact us, and we'll be responding to all inquiries coming through those channels.
Thank you, Terry. Another question. With exemption 11, capital funding, will the regulatory services assist in that determination, or do providers need to seek own advice?
Exemption 11 relates to Disability Services Act 2006. So a service conducted under funding through the Disability Services Act 2006 remains exempt.
We can elaborate further on that question after the webinar. Thank you, Terry. Another question, could we get clarification as to who is an associate? Example, support workers assisting with a medication. So to answer that question, clarification as to who's an associate. So the associate is somebody that is working with the residential service provider at the residential service, managing the property, managing the residents, managing the operation of the business at the residential service. The question is also example support workers assisting with a medication. This also depends if there's an NDIS agreement and they are services coming in from externally, then this is not classified as an associate. They don't need to be an associate if these are services under an NDIS agreement. Because we deal with residential services, they have RTA rooming agreements or general tenancy agreements. So in this case, it appears that this would fall under the NDIS agreement. We don't have too much experience with the NDIS agreements, but just to answer that question, then they wouldn't be an associate, no. So the next question, if we have 16 residents over 5 locations, would this be classed as a residential service?
Difficult to say on the limited information, but I think there's a high likelihood that it would be captured as a residential service. And it's a good example of where we'd like to sit down with the service provider and get a clear understanding on how the portfolio is used, what type of tenancy arrangements they have in place for those properties. So for example, with 16 residents, one of the questions we'd be asking is, are they on general tenancy agreements at each of the 5 locations, or are they on individual rooming agreements at each of those 5 locations? If the answer is yes, they're on general tenancy agreements, then they would not be captured. If they are on individual rooming agreements, we would then need to consider the matter further to provide advice on capture.
The next question, would the zoning change with the council completing the building certification?
There has been some changes to the Planning Act recently to make it easier to get planning approval to build properties that could be used as not just residential services, but for any particular purpose. There are still building classification requirements, which are separate to the planning requirements. And if you have questions around building classification requirements, you would need to discuss those with your relevant local council as to whether the property has the correct classification or not for use as a residential service. They're not decisions that the department makes, and there's no mention of building classification under the legislation, but the department is aware that the local councils want to make sure that properties do have the correct classification if they're going to be used as a residential service. And that classification can be different depending upon the size of the cohort of residents living at that property.
Another question, how does registration as residential service apply to SDA, which comes under the NDIS Act and associated rules and conditions? SDA providers registered with the NDIS Commission already go through registration and accreditation processes, and this will just be another example of doubling up on compliance requirements.
And that's a very good question. And there are a lot of similarity. There is some crossover, and what we're trying to ensure is that we're minimising the amount of duplicate regulation. So, for example, with the accreditation components of our compliance activity, we don't capture the NDIS provided services. We would be looking at whether operators have any non-NDIS registered residents living at those services and what additional services are being provided to those non-NDIS residents for determining the level of accreditation. We do have a number of already registered services that have a combination of NDIS clients and non-NDIS clients. So we already work with approximately 30 registered providers that are captured under both regulatory frameworks, and we're looking at how we can minimise the duplication. There are some key differences. So in terms of registration and what I have gone through with the presentation today, the MP 5.7, that applies only to residential services. There are some different requirements in that to property requirements under SDA, and also from the fire safety component, particularly for those larger providers that have 6 or more residents. Again, there are some differences between the fire safety requirements for a residential service and the fire safety requirements for an SDA property. So where there is duplication, we're trying to minimise that wherever we can, but we do have to work with providers around where there are differences in the regulatory frameworks and what action needs to be taken.
If we do have to register, are you accepting the NDIA check as proof of a suitable person?
That's something I'm happy to look into. We would need to have a conversation with the NDIA around what action they take to verify who is a suitable person, and if it is mostly similar to the process that we are required to take under our legislation, then we would be happy to accept it.
Another question, does the multiple property requirement for 4 or more persons only apply to rooming agreements?
If I can answer the question this way, any residential service, all residential services have rooming agreements. If you are using general tenancy agreements, then it's not a residential service, irrespective of how many properties you might be providing services across.
Okay, we have another question. If we provide SIL services to people who pay rent direct to Department of Housing or similar, do we need to include these properties in our assessment form?
No. So properties which are owned and operated by the Department of Housing are exempt from registration. You can add them to the form if for completeness sake, but they wouldn't be captured in a registration for residential services.
Thanks, Terry. And with the registration fee, is this per property or per provider?
It's per registration. So if there are multiple properties within a registration, then that fee covers those multiple properties. If a service provider has to have multiple registrations because they could be providing different residential services in different locations and those services have no relationship to each other, then it's going to be a fee for each residential service. So it's not a matter of one provider, one registration. It really comes down to how is that portfolio being used and what of that portfolio is captured. So a provider might have a large portfolio and only some things are captured as a residential service, but many things are then not captured as a residential service. So it could be a case that everything is captured. It could be a case that some things are captured, but other things are not. Or it could be a case that nothing is captured. Again, it comes down to how is that portfolio being used and does the makeup of the accommodation, of the residents of the accommodation meet that definition of a residential service?
Next question. What is the timeline for registration of the service and where properties may not be compliant for the purpose of this service? What will the grace period be for the service to relocate residents, etc., thinking private head leases that may not meet building classification of the MP 5.7?
So at this stage, we're engaging around data and seeking information to get a sense of what capture looks like. And that's going to take a significant period of time. I believe we've just written 547. It's going to take a significant amount of time to work through all that data and work with all those providers to get a sense of what's captured and what's not captured. For those properties that are captured, going through the registration process can also be a significant period of time as well. There's no timeline defined in the legislation. We'd be looking at how we can partner with those organisations through that process and where we can provide assistance to ensure that those properties that should be registered can be registered. There is the risk that some properties that need to be registered can't for various reasons. And then we would be looking as the department to work with that provider around what other accommodation options might be available for the residents that are in that property if it no longer can be used as accommodation. So again, there's no timeframes for those things within the legislation, We'll be looking at working methodically through those problems with providers. This isn't a short-term process. This will take a significant amount of time to work through all these issues. But if any providers are concerned around the potential that they do have stock that can't be registered, I'd be keen to sit down with them sooner rather than later to have a conversation.
Another question. So to clarify, NDIS participants in SDA properties are not captured, but residents in non-NDIS SDA properties should be included in the assessment.
SDA properties can be captured. If an SDA property has 4 or more residents and each of those residents are on rooming accommodation agreements and those residents share facilities or services, then that SDA property would be captured. But that's not just limited to SDA, that's any property. So a property that is rented from the private market, a provider is head leasing that property and then subleasing it to 4 residents, and those 4 residents are receiving SIL services. If those 4 residents are on rooming accommodation agreements and they're sharing facilities, then that property would also be captured. However, if the SDA property, all the residents there are on a general tenancy agreement, then it would not be captured. And the same with the scenario where a property is head leased from the private market.
Another question. Will the registration agreement be annual fee or every 3 year on renewal?
So there's a one-off registration fee, and then there is a separate set of fees around accreditation, and that is set on a per resident amount.
Correct.
I don't have it in front of me, but I think it's like $33 per resident, Sandy?
Mm-hmm. Yes, correct.
And then that's every 3 years. So there's a one-off fee for registration. There's a fee that gets paid at accreditation, and that's per resident. Every 3 years post that, we then have to do a re-accreditation of that service.
Next question. Given the NDIA Safeguarding Commission's auditing of properties is so similar to the documentation provided to date, what is the benefit to providers of SIL services and, more importantly, people with a disability?
I understand why there are a lot of questions about that. Unfortunately, our experience has been that even properties that are captured through the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission activities can still have concerning practices or issues of welfare issues with residents. And as I mentioned earlier, we have at the moment 30 operators that are registered under both. And unfortunately, I can't confirm that all of those 30 are meeting the requirements of both sets of performance requirements. So my team and the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission do a lot of joint work around performance and quality improvement, and I can see that that's going to only grow over time rather than diminish.
Next question. If a property is used for both respite short-term accommodation and for permanent residence, property has capacity for more than 4 occupants, would this be considered a residential service? The entire property may be used for permanent SIL clients depending on need.
Potentially, yes. Because it's available for it depends on whether it's available for occupancy by 4 or more of your permanent residents. If it's just being used for respite short-term accommodation, it's unlikely to be captured as a residential service. In the legislation, it has a section that talks about what is the property mostly used. If it's mostly used for respite, then it's unlikely to be captured. If it's mostly used for long-term accommodation for residents, and there's 4 or more of those, then it's likely to be captured. Again, this is a good example of we really need to get into some of the nitty-gritty around how a particular property is used to be able to provide advice. which is why we've asked for such a comprehensive set of data to be provided up front to help us to identify and prioritise some of those providers that we need to then go and engage with around these types of variations of property usage.
The next question is, could you provide a definition of a level 2 food service?
Oh, essentially it's meals. So where as part of the arrangement for living at the property, that person also gets meals arranged or cooked or provided for them. The residents would pay for those meals, so that there's normally a daily charge that they pay their service provider for that food. And then there's a series of standards that have to be met in the provision of that food, and that's beyond the normal licensing requirements that councils might have for the provision of food in a residential service. It's fairly straightforward whether there's an arrangement in place for meal provision or not.
And what is the $33 per person for which is part of the renewal of accreditation application?
So essentially it's cost recovery for the department conducting the auditing process. It in fact doesn't cover the costs of auditing. However, it's in the regulation, so we don't really have any control over how the fees are set. They're essentially set for us. It is supposed to be a cost recovery, but again, the $300 or so for registration.
We are already registered for one non-disability property. Do we need to re-register for any other properties which are now considered a residential service?
Yeah, if it is considered a residential service, then it would have to get registered as a residential service. So there are providers who are registered as residential services and they do other things as well. We do have some providers that provide other homelessness type accommodation. We have some providers that provide even community housing, or we even had one that was doing an aged care centre. So yes, you may need to be registered for different types of accommodation provision.
And the last question is, who is responsible for the registration process, the SIL provider or the SDA provider?
The person or company that runs the residential service. So we would be looking at who has control over decisions around the occupants, who is entering into the tenancy arrangements with the occupants or residents, who's collecting rent. So depending upon which party in that arrangement is undertaking those functions, that's the party that would need to be registered as the residential service provider. If you do have any subsequent questions, we do have a dedicated phone number and mailbox that you can be forwarding your questions to. We look forward to organisations providing the data so we can kick off with the assessments on capture, and we look forward to working with you all into the future. Thank you very much for joining us today.